Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. This week for a Minisode, we're joined by a flared user on the subreddit, Lubyak. Welcome.
Hello, yes, I'm very excited to be here for my second Minisode.
And we're here to talk about the Second Sino-Japanese War. The basis of this episode is an answer that was written on the subreddit recently on the topic of, this question. What were Imperial Japan's war goals in the Second Sino-Japanese War, and why did they fail? So, I guess the most obvious place to start is kind of what generally, in the shortest terms possible, is the answer to that question that we can then elaborate on in detail.
Right, so of course this is one of those questions that you can either answer with a single sentence or you can answer with an entire book. The shortest form of the answer that I can conceivably give is that Japan's war goals were very poorly defined. They were constantly shifting, and they simply failed to achieve them because they were trying to place too much pressure on a China that was increasingly resistant to international, especially Japanese pressure.
Increasingly resistant obviously suggests a kind of a longer term process, and obviously you can, in theory, go back to the 6th century when the Japanese emperor rather controversially suggested that he was an emperor in a communique to the emperor of the Tang. But obviously, that's probably a bit of an extreme point. Where would be a reasonable place to start if we're trying to talk about longer term processes behind this?
I would say that probably, still going back very, very early, but still relatively recently, perhaps probably the best starting point would be the First Sino-Japanese War, which was fought between Japan under the Meiji Emperor at just after the what we would consider the tail end of the Meiji Restoration, and the Qing Empire, which I am sure in this area you will have lots to contribute on. But to give the short summary, the First Sino-Japanese War was a conflict between the Qing Empire and Japan. It was fought primarily in Korea, southern Manchuria, and the Yellow Sea, and Japan was able to win several key victories and force the Qing government to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which saw Japan take over Taiwan, remove Qing influence from Korea, and theoretically secured Japanese control of the Liaodong Peninsula with the important harbor of Dalian, or as it's commonly known in a lot of Western language historiography, Port Arthur. However, not long after the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed, we have the triple intervention by Western powers, Russia, Germany, and France, that saw some of Japan's gains removed and handed back over, some of which are handed over to Russia. Which then kind of segues into the next point, which is how Japan starts to get more and more involved in China. In 1904 to 1905, you have the Russo-Japanese War, which is a conflict between Russia and Japan over their imperial interest in both Manchuria and Korea. Japan was able to win several costly victories against the Russians, especially on land. They also won several more decisive victories at sea, and this effectively enabled Japan to secure Korea within its own sphere of influence. Japan would later officially annex Korea. And Japan also took over Russian concessions in southern Manchuria, especially around Port Arthur and the South Manchurian Railway. Moving on from that, probably the next most important thing is Japan's relationship to China in the immediate aftermath of the Xinhai Revolution, which, for our listeners, is the fall of the Qing dynasty and its replacement with the Republic of China. The Xinhai Revolution takes place in 1911, the Xuantong Emperor abdicates in 1912, ending the last Chinese imperial dynasty, if we don't count Yuan Shikai's attempt at doing whatever it was he was doing. But regardless, this kind of helps change the calculus as China begins to split apart into the warlord era. Japan took advantage of both China's disintegration and Western distraction during World War I to seize German concessions in China, as well as try to force greater and greater Japanese influence in China. Especially important during over this is Japan's relationship with Jiang Zuolin, the leader of the Fengtian clique, which was based in Manchuria. Japan provided significant financial aid to Jiang, and in exchange they received larger and more in-depth economic access to Manchuria.
This is obviously quite a significant formative period in the one sense, in that it is, how Japan comes to have such strong continental interests in this broadly Northeast Asian region. But in some ways, what's quite notable is that it is happening primarily in conflict with the ailing Qing Empire. And it continues on into the Republican period, even as you have this kind of emergent problem of nationalism. And we obviously, this is something we're going to see in a moment because, well, I mean, there is literally a nationalist government that emerges.
Right, exactly. As many of our listeners would probably be well aware, during the 1920s, China was, we call this the warlord era in China, where most of China, while nominally under the Republic of China, much more power was held by these regional warlords and the constant conflict between these warlords. However, in the mid to late 1920s, we begin to see a effort towards reunification, primarily driven by the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek. The Northern Expedition especially aimed to unify China under nationalist leadership, which, even at this early stage, there were some conflicts between the rising nationalist power in China as well as Japan. During the Northern Expedition, there were clashes between Japanese troops and nationalist forces in and around Jinan in Shandong province. And it's also important to note that for the Japanese, Chinese unification seemed as a threat. Japan had previously encountered lots of public ire in China before, but as China was beginning to unify under the nationalist government, this seemed to allow this public ire to manifest in more and more impactful ways, especially on Japanese economic interests in China. A key example in this area is at the tail end of the Northern Expedition, where Zhang Zuolin is withdrawing from south of the Great Wall into Manchuria. He has also begun to distance himself more and more from Japan, partially concerned about the increasing unpopularity of his relationship with Japan. For this, he was assassinated by officers of the Imperial Japanese Army, particularly officers of the Kwantung Army, based in the Japanese concessions in and around Manchuria. In a technical sense, this would backfire slightly, as Zhang Zuolin's son, Zhang Xuelang, would technically reunify China by joining the nationalists. To carry on for this, one of the important aspects of how this reflects into wider Japanese policy is this undercurrent in Japan of a desire for autarky. World War I in particular had a profound impact on Japanese conceptions of what a future war would look like. Prior to World War I, the Japanese had kind of operated under the assumption that any future wars would be much like the First Sino-Japanese or the Russo-Japanese wars. They would be relatively short. There would be neutral powers available. And so even though Japan had a relatively limited economic, industrial, and resource base, these issues could be circumvented by foreign loans, importing resources from overseas, and more importantly, the war would be relatively short and could be taken care of relatively quickly. But World War I really did change that, and Japan saw what, to their mind, was a very concerning prospect of one of the world's great industrial powers, the German Empire, simply being ground down to nothing by the attrition of war and the lack of access to neutral markets. Especially within the Imperial Japanese Army, there came this driving desire for an autarkic Japan, a Japan that could exist independent on its own resources. However, they, of course, came into the distinct problem that the Japanese Empire in the 1920s, which consisted of the Japanese home islands, Korea, Taiwan, and some of the minor outlying territories, was simply insufficient to provide the resources it needed. Japan would need to find additional sources of resources to sustain its industrial economy. Manchuria, in particular, seemed to be a very tempting option for Japan, especially given that there was an already established Japanese presence there. This takes us to 1931 and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Japanese forces swept into Manchuria, but notably, this was not a policy that had been crafted in Tokyo and then executed on the ground by Japanese officers there. Rather, it was carried out on the initiative of relatively junior Japanese officers on the ground in Manchuria, and was basically later ratified and supported by the government in Tokyo, who could not really back down from a situation where their own army had invaded a part of China without their authorization. But Japan's presence in Manchuria would steadily expand. Japan would invest very heavily into developing Manchurian resources, but there was still a bit of a divide in Japanese policy. There were certain officers who wished simply to focus on developing Manchuria's resources and continuing to expand Japan's industrial base, and there were those who wanted a crash program for a war with the Soviet Union within a few years. Part of the reason for this kind of clash of policy that was never really truly settled. But there were certain areas of agreement, and one of those areas of agreement was definitely in northern China, especially the areas around Beijing, parts of what is now Inner Mongolia. And here we start to see the true genesis of what will become the Second Sino-Japanese War. Basically everyone in Tokyo and in Manchuria would agree that Japan had a very strong interest in North China. However, the strong disagreement would come as to what form that interest should take. Certain officers would press for a full-scale detachment of North China into another Manchukuo-like puppet state, whereas others thought that Japan should be content with a strong economic presence there and, more importantly, should aim for cooperation with the nationalist government. And this presence and continued presence of Japan in North China, based from their base in Manchuria, is how really began to have a strong impact on their relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. And for a moment, we need to kind of switch perspectives from the perspective of Japanese in Tokyo and in Manchukuo to the perspective of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists in Nanjing. Chiang at this point was much more focused on resolving his internal problems, primarily his conflict with the Chinese Communist Party, and he was focusing most of his resources on trying to deal with that. And at this point, he was taking a very conciliatory, or somewhat I call it, appeasement attitude towards Japan, backing down on many key points and trying to give Japan some so that they would, so to allow for some degree of cooperation, primarily because Chiang did not deem that China was ready to face off against Japan. However, this policy was incredibly unpopular among Chinese civilians, and this unpopularity really helped to manifest where you have large-scale student protests in Nanjing and Shanghai, not necessarily aimed at Japan, but more aimed at the nationalists and their continuing appeasement of Japan. And this kind of comes to a head with the famous Xi'an incident, where Chiang is kidnapped by his own generals and is forced to agree to a united front with the communists. And this kind of signifies an increasingly hardline attitude towards the Japanese, especially in North China. And this is what kind of sets the stage for what will become the Marco Polo Bridge incident. At this point, we are in the mid 1930s, and at this stage, neither Nanjing nor Tokyo really want a war. What happens, again, is not necessarily a scheme that has been devised in Tokyo and then implemented on the ground as a grand master plan for executing Japanese policy. But rather, what happens is that a Japanese army unit operating south of Beijing conducts night maneuvers. On their return to barracks, they find a soldier missing. They suspect that he might be located in a nearby town that is occupied by Chinese nationalist troops. The Japanese demand the right to search the town for their missing soldier. And bear in mind, by this point, the missing soldier has turned up back at barracks anyway, but events have spiraled out of control at this point. Shots are fired, and the Imperial Japanese Army, in their classic response, chooses to escalate. And Chiang, instead of trying to back down or even appease the Japanese, responds in kind and puts up much stronger resistance against the Japanese. And the Japanese army continues to escalate the situation. They request reinforcements from Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea. And in Tokyo, ultimately, the Japanese decide that this situation could be an easy solution to their question policy in North China. The Japanese army estimates a relatively short war. They want a few years. They think that a few months and a few hundred million yen will be enough to deal a decisive blow against Chiang and force him to come to some kind of arrangement that would secure North China as a source for further Japanese expansion and exploitation. Of course, that is not how it turned out, and what was predicted to be a 3-month war would instead last from 1937 all the way through till 1945, when Japan would surrender to the United States and the rest of the Allies at the end of World War II.
And this spiraling is the product of the fact that, as with a lot of infamous attempts to force decisive battle, kind of doesn't happen. I mean, there's obviously the question of, well, why not? How is it that there's a failure to force the decisive engagement, or is it that the battles just turn out not to be decisive?
It is a bit of both, I would say. From very early on, Japan had the idea that they would fight a quick, decisive victory. They would knock out China's key centers, the pillars of Chinese resistance, and Chiang would come to the negotiating table. They would sign an agreement that was beneficial to Japan, and the war would be over. At first, Japan thought that this center of mass would be Chiang's military forces. And while it was not as short or easy of a conflict as might be imagined, the Japanese were still able to defeat many of Chiang's conventional forces, both in North China around Beijing and also, more importantly, in the Yangtze River in the Battle of Shanghai. Many of Chiang's key and most well trained and well equipped units were destroyed. Japan thought that seizing Shanghai and beginning to move up the Yangtze towards Nanjing would force Chiang to come to the negotiating table, but of course it didn't. Similarly, after this, the Japanese decided they wanted to focus on the Chinese industrial base, kind of concentrated in and around Nanjing, began moving up the infrastructure, seizing much of the limited Chinese industrial base, but still that did not succeed in bringing Chiang to the negotiating table. And of course, the Japanese did. There were efforts from Japan to negotiate, but this is where the inability of Japan to have a consistent policy would truly come into play. To further this, we need to kind of switch our perspective a little bit to not necessarily the situation on the front lines in China, but the political situation in Tokyo. As the war in China has, of course, become much larger than anyone expected it to be, and the original goals that the Japanese had delivered, which mostly included a free hand in North China, Chiang cracking down on anti-Japanese activity within China, and cooperation against communists in Mongolia, quickly began to change as the Japanese were forced to pour more and more resources into this conflict, and they wanted to extract more and more concessions. From these kind of original demands in 1937, the Japanese also demanded full-on administration of North China. They wanted demilitarization around Shanghai, the Great Wall, and they wanted larger Japanese forces available to intervene in central China. By January of 1938, the Japanese basically give up on the idea of negotiating with Chiang at all and effectively declare that they will not negotiate with him and they will wait until there is a new Chinese government that would be willing to negotiate with them. Most likely some form of Japanese puppet regime. And as we can tell, the war goals shifted, both from originally from relatively limited goals centered on Japanese interest in North China to fully unlimited goals that basically involved full-scale regime change across all of China. And to kind of get back to the original question, which is why didn't any of these basically disasters bring Chiang to the negotiating table, we kind of have to change our view to the Chinese war capital at Chongqing. Despite the incredible losses that the Japanese have inflicted on the nationalist government, the destruction of the majority of Chiang's pre-war armed forces, the occupation of China's industrial base, quite simply, agreement with Japan was off the table entirely. I believe at one point Chiang even remarks upon receiving one set of Japanese demands that even if he were to accept these demands, the Chinese people would revolt and overthrow him and continue the war. I would say that Chiang finally gathered the impression that he could not domestically support any further accommodation with Japan. As we talked about before, Japanese involvement in China was increasingly more and more unpopular among Chinese citizens, leading to various forms of boycotts and pressures for Chiang and the nationalist government to take a stronger hand against the Japanese. As the war continued and Japanese war goals escalated, this kind of internal political pressure on the nationalists to not give in similarly kind of helped to steal Chinese resolve, not only among the political elite, Chiang and his generals and the other senior leadership of the nationalist government, but also among common people to continue fighting, to continue supporting the war against Japan. Ultimately, this has been a very, very long way of kind of circling back to the short version I provided at the beginning, where Japanese war goals continue to shift and they grow so much that any kind of settlement that Japan will accept is completely politically unacceptable for the nationalists.
We've wrapped up chronologically, but there's obviously little details we can go back into. And I think if we go back in slightly reverse order, I mean, one of the big things that obviously marks the shift in Japanese war goals is the creation of these collaborationist governments, which obviously imply that they are increasingly not regarding Chiang as a legitimate government.
It's a kind of a fascinating area that I am definitely curious in reading more into about. But the Japanese and their collaborationist governments keep kind of changing about quite a bit, as they are, much like a lot of other Japanese policy, not necessarily very well coordinated as some kind of central governing authority. Of course, you have the puppet government in Manchukuo, where they bring the former Qing emperor and put him on the throne of Manchu land, as it might be translated, and that kind of becomes a model that the Japanese would try to replicate elsewhere. And you have a plethora of other collaborationist governments that are set up in various forms by various Japanese authorities. The most famous one, of course, is Wang Jingwei's government in Nanjing that takes over. That's kind of a Yangtze River area. And quite interestingly, the Japanese almost seem to view Wang more as a political tool rather than any kind of future collaborationist government. While, as much as the Japanese declared in 1938 that they would no longer be negotiating with Chiang in any other way rather than attempting to kill him, later on they would, in fact, kind of offer terms which involved ending their support for Wang Jingwei, handing him over to the nationalists in exchange for some of the concessions they demanded. So the Japanese definitely were trying, by a certain point, to have some kind of replacement government in China that would be more willing to accommodate their demands. But of course, in this aspect, like with other things, they faltered, at least partially due to any kind of lack of unity. It wasn't so much that they had prepared a puppet government that they would support in place, but it was much more that they eventually cobbled together some form of policy and attempted to use that however they might to attempt to something that would become very, very important for Japan, which was ending the war in China. And their efforts to end the war in China are, of course, what set them on the path to joining the wider global conflict by their attacks on the United States and the British and the other European colonial powers.
It's not immediately relevant because I think we focused mainly on the period up to about 1941. But what was the view from, say, Washington or Moscow on the developing state of the conflict? And how much external support was there for Chiang before Japan suddenly kind of forced everyone to be involved, whether they liked it or not?
So quite interesting. Chiang seems to have had support at one time or another from almost every other major power. During the Northern Expedition, he is, of course, heavily supported by the Soviet Union, who helped him establish the Whampoa Military Academy, which would, of course, go on to train many of his most well-known members of his army. Later on, Chiang would cooperate very closely with Weimar Germany to produce some of his best units. And later on, which is really what kind of links the war in China to the wider conflict, is that the United States begins to take a much larger interest in the conflict. The United States in particular is very, very concerned about Japanese expansionism in East Asia. And really, one of its primary goals is it wants to maintain the open door in China. It wants to maintain equal global access to the Chinese market for all global trading powers. And this stands in exact conflict with what Japan wants to do, which is fundamentally it wants to bring China as an integral part of a Japanese autarkic economic unit. And part of what leads to the escalation is also that after having defeated Chiang militarily, occupied much of China's most economically productive areas, Japan begins to view the remaining sources of support for Chiang as the international aid he is receiving from the British and the Americans. And it is their efforts to cut off this aid, which are at least a significant reason for why Japan ultimately moves for war against the Western powers. But to kind of circle back to Moscow's position, Moscow is also quite invested in this conflict, although not necessarily so much in due to the presence of the Chinese communists, as much as that would seem interesting. Rather, Moscow's policy is heavily focused on trying to avoid the specter of a two-front war for the Soviet Union. Moscow definitely does not want a coordinated assault on Russia from Germany in the west and Japan in the east, which, especially at certain points in the 1930s, Moscow thought was quite possible. In that respect, there was significant Soviet involvement in attempting to hammer together the what would become the Second United Front. Now, this is an area I need to read a little bit more on because as much I'm not so much an expert in Soviet policy or necessarily more extensive Chinese history, but the Soviet Union was quite involved in the efforts to bring about the Second United Front and to kind of push Chiang to adopt a harder line against Japan. And in that respect, Soviet policy was very successful in that the escalating Second Sino-Japanese War meant that significant Japanese forces were now tied down indefinitely in China, which effectively removed any prospect for a Japanese advance into the Eastern Soviet Union for the time being.
And of course, any such attack would, of course, have had to go through Manchuria, which, in the event, the brief skirmishes of 1939 did. And it's Manchuria that I want to get onto, because what's interesting about Manchuria is that it is not necessarily historically an integral part of China. Its status under the Qing was pretty ambiguous. And I mean, to some extent, it does seem like even if Manchuria as a region was increasingly dominated by Han Chinese, even before 1931, it was mostly independent of whatever central authority existed. And so, in a sense, kind of to what extent can we characterize the Sino Japanese tension over Manchuria as kind of competing imperialisms as opposed to a more organic sort of indignation over actual deprivation of core territory?
Right. That is definitely kind of an interesting area, and kind of also ties into your area of expertise with the Qing Empire. It is definitely worth noting that in 1931, when the Japanese first invade Manchuria, there is a very, very strong Chinese public backlash. The Chinese public launches what is perhaps one of the largest, most long-lasting, and most damaging boycotts of Japanese goods from the Chinese population, which has a significant negative impact on Japanese economic interests in China. But at the same time, from a political perspective, it almost seems as though the nationalists are willing to concede on a de facto, if not de jure, recognition of Manchurian independence. One of the common goals that the Japanese want is for a international recognition of the independence of Manchuria, which of course is very heavily resisted by the Chinese general public. But Chiang and the nationalist government seems much more conciliatory to the idea. As part of the negotiations that predated the outbreak of full-scale war, Chiang, while he does not offer de jure recognition, where he would recognize Manchukuo as a independent country, he would of course continue to insist that Manchuria is part of China. He would recognize Japanese control over that. And in that respect, perhaps you can talk of it as a conflicting Chinese and Japanese imperialism over a region that is over a border region between the two of their centers of political power. And given Chinese weakness at the time, Chiang was willing to concede that, even if the move might have been unpopular. But as Japanese forces get more and more interested over in northern China, especially, that willingness starts to disappear. Many of the histories I have read seem to produce the idea that Chiang might have been willing to compromise over Manchuria, but at the same time, he was not going to compromise over North China. It's one thing to see Mukden under Japanese domination. It's another thing to see Beijing under Japanese domination. And in that respect, one way you could view this is that Japan ceases to be a border threat to Chinese territorial integrity, picking at the outskirts of China proper, taking away Manchuria, Taiwan, etc. And as Japan attempts to force its economic interests into especially northern China, the environs of Beijing, and central China in and around Shanghai, that switches the threat that Japan poses to China as no longer simply imperial conflict over border regions, but an existential threat to the existence of a Chinese polity as a whole. And in that respect, you can definitely see where that hardening of resistance comes from. There's definitely something that probably could be said about the popular conceptions in China over whether Manchuria is an integral part of China, but I think that's not really there's not really much I can go on into that kind of social aspect.
That's fair, and I think it adds a dimension to the Sino-Japanese conflict that we do need to see it not just as these monolithic blocks of China and Japan, but as we've been stressing throughout, you've got warlords like the Zhangs, you've got this sort of ambiguous territorial middle spaces that are or are not integrally China, and you have got these third-party foreign powers who are also interested and involved to one extent or another. We didn't go into this very specifically, but I mean, Nazi Germany was obviously backing both horses for a while.
Yes. Of course, as I mentioned, the Germans were heavily involved in supporting Chiang's army in the 1930s. The Nazi-Japanese alliance only kind of really comes into focus in the late 1930s as Germany is forced to choose between the nationalists and the Japanese as the war escalates. And ultimately, they do end up backing the Japanese, but it's definitely a near-run thing, as you might say.
Thank you. It's been great talking with you.
Yes. Thank you very much. I've been very glad to come on here and talk about this, and I think we've gotten through a lot, kind of given a basic idea of the kind of the complexities of what Japan was trying to accomplish in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and why ultimately its efforts faltered and failed.
Yeah, and I mean, this is not the first time you've been on, but hopefully it is not the last, and we hope to see you again.
Definitely, and I hope to be back as well. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.